Inevitably, Turkey bleeds into sort of all issues. It is the fulcrum and the pivot and all these things. And certainly Erdogan is being very good at fulcruming and pivoting and keeping us all guessing. Is it Western? Is it susceptible to Western? Is it a NATO ally? Is it turning to the east? Is it holding Europe up for a hostage to the refugee crisis? I mean, there's so many dimensions of what Erdogan's power, despite his crashing economic situation, and just an absolutely dire human rights landscape. Shall we start with Svante, because you are exhausted?
We should never do that. I'm suitably caffeinated.
Oh, you are. All right. Well, if we've got you recaffeinated, why don't you give us your perspective? Certainly, we've got this whole dramatic situation with the Saudis. We can start with the headlines, if you like.
Well, we can start with that. So, you know, I teach a course on diplomacy at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and my students yesterday were asking me if I could ever recall, you know, an instance in which a, you know, diplomatic institution like a consulate or an embassy benefiting from extraterritoriality had been used to, you know, conduct a contract murder before.
1978, maybe? Or not murder?
Well, you know, and I said, well, I came up with the Spike Dubs case, you know, which was a U.S. ambassador who was held hostage, who was killed in the failed Soviet effort to liberate him in Afghanistan. And there have certainly been many occasions when embassies have been used as places of refuge. So for you know,
Snowden,
Snowden, Julian Assange, but you know, more honorably in the past, the U.S. hosted Cardinal Mazzenti in the embassy in Budapest for many years as a resident, and some people have forgotten that in the early Reagan years, the U.S. Embassy in Moscow was home to 5 Pentecostal Christians who were trying to emigrate from the Soviet Union. So it's been a place of refuge, but never before the scene of a snuff movie, as far as I can tell. So this is a little bit unprecedented, and I think the Turkish government is struggling to figure out what's going on. They may be right in the things that they've leaked in terms of what happened. I think we really just don't know. I've seen some press reporting that indicates the U.S. intelligence believes this may have been a rendition effort that somehow went bad, which is also completely believable. But I think it's impossible to say anything with any certainty because we just don't know very much about this, other than the sort of bare outlines that Khashoggi went into the consulate, never came out. And
cameras went off,
and there were these 15 Saudis who came in and came out in 2 private planes, all of which seems a little suspect. So I think we'll have to see. I mean, obviously, the Saudi-Turkish relations were already not very good because they've been arrayed on different sides in Syria, because the Turks have a troop deployment in Qatar, which has been the object of obviously an internecine Arab civil war over the last year or two. The Qataris dropped $15 billion into the Turkish economy not long ago, as the Turks have begun to face their own very serious economic crisis that is coming.
Describe that a little bit. I mean, the scale of this really goes underreported, I think.
You know, truth in advertising requires me to acknowledge that I have been predicting a Turkish economic crisis since 2009, and I will be right eventually. I think the time is coming soon. I don't know, Svante may disagree, but I think we're finally getting there. But no, Turkey has been benefiting over the last few years from very low interest rates driven by the U.S. Fed keeping interest rates low. Interest rates, as everybody knows, including anybody who was watching the market yesterday, are going up. They're going to continue to go up, and that has made the price of servicing debt in Turkey, including a lot of commercial debt, very, very difficult. And there are basically a lot of big projects that were started in Turkey that are not going to be able to be paid off.
And this is externally or internally held by and large?
It's both.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of the exposure, I think, and Svante may know better than I, but I believe it's the Spanish and French banks that have the biggest exposure here, somewhere along the lines of 80 billion, I think. The total is like 300 billion something that they have to come up with. So 15 billion is actually just a kind of drop in the bucket. But this is going to get, this issue could obviously have a lot of repercussions. It could have a lot of repercussions for the U.S.-Saudi relationship. I mean, if you hear what members of Congress are saying, I think this is going to be a very big problem, and it's potentially a vulnerability for the Trump administration, because the administration, I think, did the right thing in trying to repair relations with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that had been damaged under the Obama administration, in part because of the single-minded pursuit of the JCPOA by the Obama administration. But I think one of the downsides of the way the administration has gone about this has been that it's been done in a way that was very congenial to the Saudis, which was as a kind of family-to-family relationship, especially between Jared Kushner and Mohammed bin Sultan. And I think that's always, well,
not quite as close as this, but
this is a little bit different because you've got the president's family involved, as opposed to personal connections that people have had over the years. There are a lot of U.S. officials that have had personal connections. The Bush family had a lot of personal connections, but it was not a kind of family connection,
So, but in the scheme of how this works with Turkey and our relations with both and either,
that's a little harder to predict because our relations with Turkey are so freighted with so many other tensions. The case of Pastor Brunson, the question about the sale of S-400s by Russia to Turkey, the pending
which is going ahead,
the pending F-35 sale, and I know that Secretary Pompeo addressed some of this last night.
Well, no, he didn't
at
actually.
The dinner. Oh, he didn't?
He stepped away from it.
Well, he was asked about it anyway. So there's a lot going on in the U.S.-Turkish relationship, and as you pointed out, to your basic point, Turkey is what Paul Kennedy at Yale University a number of years ago called an absolutely pivotal country, and it's just it's the basic law of real estate: location, location, location.
And culturally as well, it has been.
Neighbor of Iran, neighbor of Iraq, neighbor of Syria, a Black Sea littoral state, so it's a neighbor of Ukraine, so it sits cheek by jowl with that conflict, and it's the doorway to Europe, particularly for refugee flows. So it sits at the center of just about every major contention or issue that we have, and so what we Americans would I think want, and whether the Khashoggi thing gets in the way of that or not, I don't know. I think it'll depend a little bit on how it plays out. Hard to predict right now. But what we should want is what we do want, which is a reliable ally who shares our values and our objectives, both in these many kind of regional conflicts and global issues. And unfortunately, increasingly, that's not what we have. And that's not what we have had, unfortunately, I would say, for the better part of a decade.
Svante, as Eric points out, there's no end of leverage in Erdogan's pocket that he's using very cleverly with the Europeans and the rest of them. On this particular issue of Khashoggi, he's effectively done the same thing. I don't know if he's used bone saws to hack up pieces of journalists, but he's certainly incarcerated any number of opposition journalists to the point that they're very neutralized, to say the least. So how is he going to play this, do you think?
I think it really depends on what would be useful for him. Because as you point out, I think this is an example, I think, of a broader region where traditional rules of behavior don't apply anymore. I think it's Robert Kaplan, the writer, who points out that countries like China, Russia, Turkey, and Iran aren't behaving like nation states constricted by the rules of an international system anymore. They're behaving like medieval empires, which means you take a sudden decision, you move into somebody else's territory, and you're not really constrained by any kind of rules of engagement. And I think the Saudi behavior here suggests the same kind of thing, that we're really talking about a part of the world, and not only in their part of the world, but they are there are a lot of countries that feel liberated to behave in ways that they wouldn't have done 5 or 10 years ago. And Turkey is one of them. So I think if Erdogan is at all upset about this, it's because it happened in Turkey rather than the fact that it happened at all. But more to the Turkish-Saudi relationship, I think Eric is absolutely right in talking about their difficulties. I would say one thing we should remember is that Turkey has been vocally opposed to the reforms that Mohammed bin Salman has been engaging in Saudi Arabia. And mouthpieces for the Turkish government have cast this as some kind of U.S. Jewish plot that's going to end up with the Muslims losing Mecca and Medina. So the reforms in Saudi Arabia,
It's always the Jews.
it's always for Erdogan and for the Turkish government. It is. I mean, this is
Yeah.
this is the worldview in which they were steeped. This is the ideology to which they belong. They sometimes hide it. They sometimes don't. Increasingly less so, by the way, unless they need to. When I predict that if the economy goes worse, they're going to stop talking about the Jewish world conspiracy, at least outside, because they're going to need to be more, to be accepted in a way that they'll be more constrained. But I think the point is that they see everything going on in Saudi Arabia as a dangerous attack on the Muslim world by the enemies of the Muslim world, led by, of course, the Trump administration in Israel. So I think that's how Turkey views Saudi Arabia, but then it becomes a little complicated because this involves the United States and a person who writes for U.S. media. So I think it's a little hard for the Turks to interpret what actually this...
The scale of this will be, yeah.
Yeah, and what's actually going on.
But did you want to make further points?
Well, I mean, I think the broader issue you were alluding to earlier is, I mean, if you look at the Turkish behavior, I would say that, and I think Eric might agree with me on some of those points, Turkey has certain understandable concerns in specific issue areas. I mean, the fact that a U.S. resident cleric, Fethullah Gulen, was most likely the person orchestrating a coup against Erdogan, that you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to wonder, how and what did the Americans know, and why aren't they, giving this guy over to us? They don't really understand that you have certain standards of evidence in this country that the Turks haven't been able to meet in terms of what they've been serving to the Justice Department. On the issue of Syria, I think also Turkey has certain understandable concerns. We are cooperating in Syria with an organization that is affiliated with the PKK, which we consider to be a terrorist organization. But because they're in Syria and wearing different insignia, we help them and we work with them. Now, maybe we have to do that, and the administration now with James Jeffrey is trying to find a way to deal with this with the Turks. So I think the point is that on certain issue areas, I understand the concerns and where the Turks are coming from, but that's not really the issue. The issue is that Turkey as a whole, the relationship is not dependent on some of these specific issue areas. There are deeper issues, there are deeper changes happening, and those are happening in Turkey and in how Turkey views itself. And I think it's very clear, at least since 2011 and Turkey's reaction to the Arab upheavals, but even before, that Turkey does not view itself as a Western country.
Right.
It views itself as a country basically opposed to the West and to Western and American imperialism. And that's how you have to understand Turkey's relationship with Russia, with China especially increasingly, and with others that they don't really like the Iranians. And that's a much deeper undercurrent of what's going on in Turkey that we are not able to change for the time being.
Right. The trends towards Islamization were going on from the get-go when his appointments in the Justice Department, early
well,
on.
yes and no. They were, but most of the appointments were appointments of Gulenists, who are also, of course, Islamists, but they're a different group of Islamists.
Yeah.
So he had to clean out the Gulenists from the state apparatus, which means that in certain ways you have a certain reduction of card-carrying Islamists in the Turkish bureaucracy because Erdogan just doesn't have enough qualified people from his Naqshbandi orientation to put into government offices. So he had to rely on the traditional far-right Turkish nationalists to a larger extent, who don't necessarily like us and very much anti-American. On the other hand,
not
I
entirely.
think they're not. I'd take a Turkish nationalist over a Turkish Islamist any day because we can at least sit down and talk to them. Whereas with the Islamists, you're just on such different planets when it comes to how you look at the world and how you look at international affairs. I mean, Turkish nationalists don't like Iran, they don't like Russia, which means that you could find some way of, in the long term, building a relationship with them. It's not going to be easy, but with the Islamists, I think there's just no way.
Jim Jeffries is a very seasoned and serious diplomat, and truly, I would agree with you, probably the best we've got in this game. I wouldn't like to think that he would take this assignment lightly or particularly need to be saddled with this particular. What do you think the remit is vis-a-vis Turkey and their role in this Syria thing with Jim?
I'm not sure Jim was actually offered this job because of his Turkey experience, and I think probably
Despite it?
Probably it was really more his experience in Iraq that I think commended him to Secretary Pompeo for this position. But having said that, I'm knowing Jim quite well and an enormous admirer of his. I do think he has, for some time, been talking about trying to fix the U.S.-Turkish relationship. And I agree with Svante that Turks have legitimate concerns, which I don't think were taken very seriously, frankly, by the previous administration, which led to a lot of, people talking past each other for a number of years about the question of the role of Kurds in Syria and Iraq and any number of other issues. I think Jim is a little bit more willing than I am to try and conciliate, some of these Turkish, complaints. I mean, my view is they have legitimate complaints, and we ought to try and see what can be done, to assuage them on these scores, but that it has to be accompanied by some rather tough messages on a number of other issues. I think Jim is less inclined to deal with the tougher issues, a lot of which go to what Svante was talking about, which are the domestic, internal, and human rights issues, which I think are fundamentally important to the relationship because so much of what Turkey does externally is driven by the country's contemporary domestic politics and Erdogan's personal domestic political agenda, that it's almost impossible to disentangle them.
Mm. And the Turks and Russia, you're an expert on all matters peripheral Central Asia.
Well, I mean, I think both the Chinese and the Russians, and I noticed this firsthand when in the institute I'm affiliated with in Sweden, we have a regular relationship with the Chinese military, and we brought over some Chinese generals, and I'm not usually part of those programs, but when they really wanted to speak about Turkey. And this was just in the time at one of the spats in the U.S.-Turkish relationship, and I saw that there was a thought process going on among these Chinese generals that how can we drive a wedge between the U.S. and Turkey. It's very clear, and they've been doing it ever since. The Russians similarly, if you are trying to divide the West and undermine the West, if you can get Turkey from one column to the other, that's a massive strategic victory for the Russians and the Chinese at this point. So I think that's very simply the way they view it. It's a country that's useful for them in various ways, but mainly it's about sowing division in NATO. That's the major objective. Now, of course, the fact that the Russians have a tendency and a history of being very forthcoming with various types of more or less doctored intelligence products. And I think regarding the coup in 2016, I don't know it for a fact, but I have pretty strong circumstantial evidence to suggest that they served a number of stuff to the Turks that implicates the United States in a coup that might not entirely be credible. Not that Erdogan necessarily needed a lot of convincing, because Gülen was always viewed by many people in Turkey, usually by secularists in Turkey, the anti-American Turkish nationalist, as an American conspiracy. But now the mainline Islamists under Erdogan view it the same way, neglecting the fact that they were the ones to open the door for the influence of Gülen in the first place. I mean, Gülen would never have had the influence in the Turkish military, bureaucracy, and society if it hadn't been for Erdogan opening the doors wide open, because he kind of mistakenly thought that because Gülen is another Sunni Muslim, he's going to obey the head of the Sunni Muslims, which is me. It's just that Gülen didn't think that Erdogan was the head of the Sunni Muslims. He thought he was. Yeah. So, that's a different story. But to make a long story short, the Russians have really been very successful at using the coup in 2016. And I think our reaction in the West to the coup was very understandable. Certain things looked fishy. How did the Turks have all these lists of names to arrest the next day? Well, that's because they were planning to get rid of the Gulenists, and that's why there was a coup in the first place. The Gulenist coup was very much a reactive coup against the forthcoming purge. It was a kind of a last-ditch effort to kind of save their position in the state. So I don't think there was anything wrong with our focus on Erdogan's abuses after the coup. But the reality is that we've kind of moved on, and we don't think about the coup in Turkey a lot. But in Turkey, this is very much a national trauma that dictates how a lot of people view politics and view the world.
Well, the sweeps have been enormous.
Well, absolutely, but that's
sectors.
not just a regime issue. I mean, many of my old secularist friends that I went to school with in Turkey back in the early 90s, who hate Erdogan, will tell me that we need Erdogan because he's the only person strong enough to get rid of all the Gulenist influence in the state. And I don't think people in the US and Europe understand this, that because of the coup and because people, and we saw this already from 2013, the Gulenists tried all these leaks of incriminating information about Erdogan, but people in Turkey, by and large, prefer the what you see is what you get Erdogan, as bad as he is.
The devil they know.
The devil they know against this
His own popularity is prodigious.
Sure, but they
Less than
are
it was,
more.
but-
They're more worried and concerned about this octopus-like Gulenist conspiracy that's everywhere but has no face.
Yeah.
Devin, Svante's comments about Russia and China, I think, are worth
And also
lingering
expand
on for a
the
second.
NATO.
So, in the previous panel, General Amrador gave, I thought, a terrific answer about why Prime Minister Netanyahu's had such a cordial and continuous engagement with President Putin, and for Turkey, it's largely the same issue. I mean, the United States. This goes back to my opening comment. The United States has, abdicated its role as being the organizer of regional security. And it's now been, a role it's abdicated for going on 10 years. Turkey, is Syria's neighbor. It's looking at this giant refugee population, and it sees that Vladimir Putin, starting in September, 2015, was making a very serious effort to make himself the arbiter of Syria's future. And what choice did he have? We gave him no choice but to pursue this relationship with Russia. Now, there's some limits to it. And one of them we may bump up against, which is there is a real serious issue with regard to the S-400, and if they deploy it, whether it could compromise some of the electronic warfare systems on the Joint Strike Fighter, which they're a Tier 1 partner in. I mean, it's a very complicated question.
Well, it's extraordinary. It's unprecedented within NATO to have that kind
Yes,
of
so I
issue
mean,
going on.
that could end up being a limit, because maybe the Turks will understand that they really can't ride both horses with one foot on each horse, or maybe they won't. We'll find out. There's another limitation, which is when I mentioned Turkey's looming economic crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Turkey has limited choices here about to whom it turns for assistance in bailing itself out of what is going to be a very, very serious debt crisis. And
the knock-on effects, I mean, with Europe, with everybody.
Yeah, so to whom do they turn? Well, I mean, the Qataris put in $15 billion, but they're not going to bail Turkey out of a $300 billion hole. The Russians don't have the means. They're not going to be able to play that role. China perhaps could play that role. They've got the money. I think General Amrador was talking about Chinese showing up with money. But there's some limits on that as well. And one of the limits is the kind of conditionality that the Chinese would likely impose on Turkey would be extremely onerous, because if you look at what they've done with their, quote, partners in the Belt and Road Initiative in Central Asia and elsewhere, they have saddled these countries with very big debts for large white elephant projects that have spread corruption throughout these places. I mean, Erdogan has no problem with corruption as long as it's directed at him. But I think there would be a problem, and then there is the problem of the Uyghurs, and that is a very big problem for Erdogan. He's been outspoken about it in the past. He's been relatively muted, in the current environment, in part because I think he is worried about his economic situation. But it'll be very difficult, I think, for him to get into bed fully with China while they're turning Xinjiang into a giant concentration camp, which is what they have done. So that leaves the one thing that he really doesn't want to do, but I think ultimately will have to do, which is turn to the IMF, because he knows we are the biggest player in determining whether the IMF will provide Turkey with decent terms and conditions for a bailout. I think he's inevitably going to be forced to that, just as he was forced to concede to the central bank that they had to raise, interest rates by 625 basis points, despite his opposition.
Right.
Because there is no alternative.
Right.
And he, I think he was looking perhaps to see if there was some European alternative. I think that was what lay behind his trip to Berlin to meet with Mrs. Merkel. Didn't work out so well.
Which is
it was a very scratchy meeting. And
given his ability to control effectively the refugee valve.
Well, but I think that might be, to a certain
A
extent,
wasting asset.
overrated, because Europe today is not like Europe 2015. You
Right.
can't just walk across Europe and the Balkans anymore. I mean, these
Right.
countries had dismantled border controls, my home country included. Well, now that we all have border controls again, even within the Schengen zone. So it's not Europe, especially. I mean, which way are you going to walk through Europe? Through North Macedonia now and the Balkans? That's not possible anymore. I don't think
and
it can
Mrs.
happen.
Merkel's position is
Yes.
very different politically now in Germany than it was 3 years ago, and she can't tolerate another
Right.
wave of this coming into Germany, which is where they would all be trying to get.
So the delivery of the S-400s, which is already a stage better than the S-300s that they're selling they're giving the Syrians. Is that where are we with that? And what is that? Does that trigger anything in NATO? You've often said there is no process by which we can eject a NATO ally.
Alas. Yeah.
And how does that play in the field of what is already a very touchy situation with America and Europe anyway?
Well, there's legislation now that controls this, which is part of the National Defense Authorization Act, which requires the Department of Defense to provide a report. I mean, the Congress had tried to prevent the delivery of F-35s to Turkey that
Right.
been contracted for. As I said, they're a tier 1 partner. They've now, because of pushback from Secretary Mattis and the administration, they agreed to a report requirement that requires the Department of Defense to report to the Congress what the consequences would be of not delivering these aircraft to Turkey. Because Turkey is a tier 1 partner, and because there are industrial co-production elements to the JSF deal, there are important components of the F-35 that are actually manufactured in Turkey, including fuselage, part of the fuselage, and some other key parts. So the question is, this is one of those things where it's a nice shiny object, and it's the kind of thing our Congress loves to grab a hold of and say, okay, here's our lever,
Yeah.
Let's pull on it. But there are potentially, downstream unintended consequences. One of which is what happens to other partners in the JSF program. Do they start to look at us as a not, unreliable supplier? That's not, a good thing. But moreover, there's going to be a delay and an additional cost if you start pushing the production of this program to the right, because you're not delivering aircraft to Turkey, and therefore they're not delivering the fuselage
Parts.
sections
Yep.
and the parts. And I don't know what the report's going to say, but my understanding is it's going to be a significant delay and a significant cost that's going to be imposed on this. And what the Congress will do, we'll have to see.
Well, I'd just like to add one thing, which is that there are two things if you try to put yourselves in the head of Turkish decision makers, which, by the way, is not just Erdogan. It's very much the Turkish military leadership as well. Again, they have realigned together on many issues, and I think we underestimate to our peril to what extent Erdogan has moved closer to the position of the military on key regional and security issues. But
that's because he needs them.
Absolutely, not because he likes them.
Needs
he
them.
has no choice.
He needs them in his ongoing battle against the Gulenists.
Definitely. But I think Turkey has so far always been able to have it both ways. Erdogan has always been able to have it both ways. He had the Obama administration and the Europeans, but especially the Obama administration, gave him never tried to force a choice. You're either with us or you're against us, to use a phrase that was used some years ago. But Erdogan has been able to play the game of somebody who was an adversary at times to the United States while also being treated as an ally. And he's
Well, Obama initially found him his best.
Oh, absolutely.
He was on the phone with him constantly, right? And
So I think if you look at Turkey, there is this quote by a former minister of Erdogan's that the Americans are weak. If you push them enough, they back off. This is the frame of mind in which the Turks are now. Now with Trump, I think they're a little bit unsure if that applies anymore. And it's a little bit unpredictable, which might not be a bad thing. But I think that brings to the second point, which is the quality of people around Erdogan. In the early days, there were serious, seasoned politicians and advisors around him. That's just not the case anymore. There are one or two, Ibrahim Kalin, maybe a few others, we might not like their views, but they're serious people who think, a couple of chess moves ahead. But most people around Erdogan are not that way. They're sycophants, they're yes men, and their family. And it means that the quality of decision-making, the quality of the information that goes into Erdogan's decision-making is very poor. Eric probably knows this better than I do. So I think we have to factor that into how we operate, that they think they're going to be able to get away with something, and they are very likely to miscalculate.
So just two observations on what Svante said. I agree with everything he said, but just two observations. So one is, neither one of these two governments, that is to say the U.S. or the Turkish government, are very well organized or staffed right now to manage these issues. So we started the conversation talking about the Khashoggi issue. We do not have a U.S. ambassador in Ankara, and we do not have a U.S. ambassador in Riyadh. And with all due respect to the enormous skill of my Foreign Service colleagues who are manning those positions as chargés, there's just a difference between having an ambassador and having someone who's a temporary, chargé d'affaires ad interim, which means that the host government can say, yeah, well, how long is interim really? So how we can wait you out. So that's the one thing I think. So some of the miscommunication about Pastor Brunson. I know that last night Secretary Pompeo, I'm told, was quite optimistic tomorrow about what's going to happen in the court, in Izmir, where Pastor Brunson is going to be having yet another court hearing. Maybe he'll be released this time. That's a possibility. I can't rule it out. I wouldn't be surprised if he weren't. But even if he is, that is just one minor irritant when you consider that we still have other U.S. citizens who are being essentially held hostage by an allied government, not to mention the 3 Foreign Service nationals who have worked for the embassy and consulates in Turkey, who've also been arrested on these falsified, same kind of falsified charges of support to terror. And I mean, if I read you the charges in these indictments, I mean, it really you would be laughing at what's being put forward as evidence for why these people should be held as accomplices to terror. So there's still issues, even if it's resolved.
And it's hard to see a situation that Erdogan thinks it's worth his while to release Brunson without some other trade-off.
The other thing I would just say, Devin, about this is, and this goes again to Svante's comments about how Erdogan has had it both ways. Part of the reason he's had it both ways, and I'm going to really make this a totally bipartisan comment because it's not just the Obama administration, it was also the Bush 43 administration in which I served, and now under the Trump administration. All 3 administrations have had the same kind of operational code when it comes to Turkey. And that operational code could be summed up as follows. Yes, they're a pain in the ass. Yes, they're a problem. Yes, there's all this bad stuff. There's anti-Semitism and Mein Kampf and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion being published in record numbers in Turkey. And yes, there's all this sort of unpleasantness with journalists and whatnot. But in the end of the day, if we treat them like an ally, eventually they will behave like an ally. And all three administrations have done this, and all with the same result, which is that nothing has changed. I mean, it's literally Einstein's definition of insanity. It's doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
There was a bit of that in Pompeo's comment last night, which was we hope over time. Now, the one big change.
Hope is not a policy.
No, but that also comes injected in this is Russia, which wasn't in 43 or even early days of Obama sitting there with a real live presence once again.
Well, and I think that's, frankly, that's a huge blind spot for American policymakers. It'd be very hard to actually acknowledge that it's our fault that a lot of this is happening because of our abdication.
Right.
I think so with the Trump administration, there are two things. One is that they've, in their particular way of doing things, they've at least shown the Turks that, all kind of behavior will not be accepted. I think that would have been a good thing if there had been a strategic approach. The problem with this is twofold. One is that the Brunson issue was picked up probably for domestic political reasons in the administration as the most offending one. I think the Brunson issue is very offending, but I think there are other issues that the Turks do that are much more consequential in the long-term strategic sense of the term that should have been the focus.
Right.
That's number one. And the second is that Erdogan had been making the point for a long time, and he even changed the date of an election with reference to the upcoming economic crisis that is going to be pushed by our enemies to undermine Turkey. And then the Brunson incident happens, the tariffs come up, and the Turkish lira collapses, and Erdogan say, see, I told you so, the Americans are out to get us, which enabled Erdogan in a certain way to escape the blame for an economic crisis that everybody knew was coming and that most people understood were Turkey's own doing.
It was a gift. It was a gift that we gave him to get him off the hook.
So I'm all for squeezing the screws a little bit on tightening the screws on Erdogan and making him and his government understand that there are certain rules of behavior, and if you can't have it both ways basically. But unfortunately, what we're likely to see now is because it's done in a haphazard way and with a selection of issue areas to focus on that are not the right ones, we're still going to be backtracking on some of those things that are most important, as in Syria, for example.
And the other question will be, we'll have to wait and see what price, the administration has paid for Brunson's release.
That's my question.
And we don't know what that is yet. I mean, we don't know
there?
whether it's going to be the release of Attila, the Hulk Bank vice president, who was convicted of the largest sanctions evasion effort
and we have some strange
in the history.
Advocates for that.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I don't know whether that's going to be it or whether it'll be Treasury not assessing a fine to Hulk Bank or some other
arrangement with the
concession
IMF
or Gulen or who knows what it's going to be. And I agree with Svante, by the way. I'm perfectly willing to believe that Fethullah Gulen personally was involved in the coup plot, but given the fact that there is no effective rule of law in Turkey, the worst thing we could do in this relationship right now is to suggest to them what they want to believe, which is that we don't have rule of law either,
Exactly.
and that this can all just be done by, one potentate talking to another.
I'd agree with that. I'd just add that for Erdogan, you see the same thing in the EU relationship, which is still after all these years of negotiating various chapters, of EU membership, physiosanitary regulations, and all the stuff you have to do to get it closer to the EU. They still believe that you can go into Brussels and essentially make a deal. We give you X, Y, Z, you give us membership. That's still the frame of mind that they're in.
And
exactly
Brussels?
this, that big men get together, talk to each other, and then everything is resolved.
And I think that's the last thing Brussels is going to accede to, particularly now.
And that's why I think they were extremely happy when Donald Trump was elected. I mean, the last thing they wanted was Hillary Clinton elected. They were quite happy. Erdogan and Trump, actually got on like gangbusters in their first several meetings, which is not altogether surprising. But what it really was Erdogan or Trump feeling that he was personally let down by Erdogan in the last Brunson hearing in July that prompted the tweet and the tariffs. And I agree with you, it's not strategic at all.
Yeah. Oh, this is the common denominator we're coming back on both panels that you were involved with, which is where is the strategic vision in this? How does Israel fit in with any of this? I mean, there have been moments where the Turks were actually, helpful. I'm not sure that we've seen any signs of.
Well, I mean, I think, Eric, you can probably answer this better than I can, but and I may have said this at another JINSA event at some point, I think the Turks do believe in the Jewish world conspiracy, and therefore, when they saw that the moment they started antagonizing Israel, things started going badly for them, the economy started going worse, there was a military coup against them, and so on and so forth, they realized that, well, maybe at this point, we should have a truce with the Israelis, and that will put some of the pressure off our back. And I think very much that's how they think right now. They feel like they're cornered, they feel like they're in a difficult position, and that's one of the reasons why you haven't seen a lot of anti-Israeli outbursts and certainly not activities on the Turkish side. That does not mean in any way that their basic position has changed, because it's completely ingrained into their worldview, their upbringing, and their ideology, which is that Israel is the great evil, to paraphrase the Iranians.
I mean, the only thing I agree with what Svante said. The only thing I would add, and General Amradar and colleagues on the Israeli side might disagree with me or point out where I'm wrong, but my sense is that in Israel there's been a tendency to allow the wish to be the father to the thought that Turkey,
Syria being my favorite example.
Turkey was for a long time a useful strategic partner for Israel. Started to go a little bit south after Erdogan came in, but there's been this hope that we can get back to that kind of pragmatic cooperation. The rest of what he says is all blah, blah, blah for internal consumption. We don't need to pay any attention to it, et cetera. Now, I hope that that's not the case anymore. And good, I'm glad to hear that. I think that while I think it is possible for Israel to do pragmatic business with Turkey on issues discreetly, case by case, it would be a huge mistake to underestimate what Svante was just talking about, which is the worldview that animates the decision makers in Turkey, and it is profoundly anti-Semitic. It's ultimately anti-Israel, and no matter how much they may, for transient tactical reasons, disguise it. And I think you can see a big problem coming down the road in the Eastern Mediterranean with regard to oil and gas platforms and Cyprus and Israel's interests
there,
and Turkey's enormously vast claims, which Turkey is the only country in the world that I know of that has the same position on the law of the sea treaty that China does. And that is something that I think people need to pay attention to, because it's a big problem coming down the road.
Well, we've discussed this incredibly pragmatic and almost reactive kind of, but certainly looking out for his own interests, and we've got Putin doing much the same kind of extraordinarily responsive, but basically, not discernible as a plan to anybody. But let's open it up to questions, and we don't have time for questions. That's why I was looking around for you. Oh shoot! I'm so sorry.
Why don't we take at least one question?
We have to take at least two. Yes, sir.
I'll make the answer short.
That 10 years ago had dinner with the Turkish ambassador and his residence, and it was a phenomenal dinner. And we were talking about playing golf together and doing all these other social things because their respect and love for Israel was there. And 2 weeks later, you had this little armada come up, which caused this crisis. Israel was adored, and then a switch was turned. What really precipitated that?
I don't think Israel was adored. I think the ambassador was doing his job. Plus, the ambassador was almost certainly not part of
it was
the...
Namek. I mean, it was Namek Tan. He was like the most pro-Israel guy in
Right.
the foreign ministry.
And where is he now?
Yes,
Sure.
he's out, right?
He's out. The foreign ministry was not fully under Erdogan's control at the time.
It is
Now it
now.
is.
Right.
So you had certain pockets of the state that hadn't been taken over, but now they have been. Whereas the Erdogan and his political party were firmly behind and orchestrated the whole Gaza flotilla.
Don't hold your breath for an invitation like that from Ambassador Kilich. Won't be coming.
I am so sorry. My favorite thing to do is have questions and answers. And Eric will tell you, I used to host him before the press corps in Europe, and I would say, you're allowed to talk for exactly 8 minutes, and then we do 2 hours of questions and answers. So next time, I swear, that's what our format will be. But I want to thank you both. It's too bad we have such violent agreement all the time with these panels.
Yes,
But
yes.
on the other hand, it makes for a very insightful and rigorous analysis, and thank you both.
Thank you, Devin.